important bipartisan legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Mississippi.
Mr. Speaker, I have no more speakers. If the gentleman from New York has no more speakers, then I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Okay. This bipartisan bill is a good bill. I urge my colleagues to support it. It builds very strongly on the initial port security bill of 2006 that was sponsored by Mr. Lundgren, who was here today, and Jane Harman, who was also in Congress at that time. It was a very good bill. This adds to it, improves on it, and it keeps up with the changes in the time. So I urge its adoption.
Gentleman from Mississippi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our nation's ports are diverse as the people they serve. The importance of this infrastructure to the global supply chain cannot be overstated. Enactment of H.R. 4005 will help ensure that our limited security resources can be targeted to those threats that put our ports at greatest risk. With that, Mr. Speaker, I urge the passage of H.R. 4005 and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 4005 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed and without objection. Gentleman from New York.
I object to the vote on the grounds that quorum is not present. I make a point of order that quorum is not present.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20 and the Chair's prior announcement, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman of New York seek recognition?
Speaker, I move the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1447 as amended by the Committee on Homeland Security.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1447, a bill to amend Title 49 United States Code to direct the Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security, Transportation Security Administration, to establish an Aviation Security Advisory Committee and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. King, and the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, it is so ordered.
Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 1447, the Aviation Security Stakeholder Participation Act of 2011. I commend Ranking Member Thompson for his dedicated work in this area. The FAA established the Aviation Security Advisory Committee in 1989, following the bombing of Pan American World Airways Flight 103. When TSA was created, the sponsorship of ASAC transferred to TSA, and it continued to provide a mechanism for industry and other outside stakeholders to inform the federal government's decision-making on aviation security matters. Despite its important contributions to security, TSA allowed the ASAC charter to expire. Last year, TSA revived the ASAC with the strong support of industry. Homeland Security Secretary Napolitano subsequently appointed 24 new ASAC members. H.R. 1447 simply codifies the ASAC, which exists today, and ensures that it remains intact, providing necessary stakeholder guidance to TSA. It establishes important working groups focused on air cargo, general aviation, and airport perimeter security, all of which have unique challenges that require a collaborative effort to solve. In these difficult economic times, it is essential for TSA to get the input of stakeholders on security procedures and technology to ensure that it is spending its limited resources on initiatives that will enhance security for the traveling public without compromising the freedom of people and goods to move freely. I urge the adoption of this bipartisan bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 1447, the Aviation Security Stakeholder Participation Act, and yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, effective coordination between stakeholders and the regulators is critical to the implementation of policies that work. To that end, we have the responsibility to ensure that policy is informed by the realities on the ground. Arguably, nowhere is the need for policy coordination more important than at our nation's airports. Given that the aviation sector remains an attractive target for terrorists, the difference between a security policy that works and one that does not can be all that stands between life and death. That is why I introduced H.R. 1447, the H.R. Security Stakeholders Participation Act. This legislation will ensure that the voices of those subject to policies and protocol put in place by TSA are heard and their recommendations are considered. It does so by directing the TSA to establish an Aviation Security Advisory Committee. For years, such an advisory committee existed and worked effectively with TSA on matters such as aviation security methods, equipment, and procedures. For instance, in 2003, the ASAC Cargo Working Group, which included the Cargo Airline Association, made recommendations that formed the basis of TSA's program for 100% screening of air cargo. Unfortunately, during the last administration, the charter for this advisory committee was allowed to lapse and the committee ceased operation. While I'm pleased that in response to my bill, the Obama administration reestablished this committee on its own authority, I strongly believe that it is critical that the Aviation Security Advisory Committee be codified in law to ensure that TSA's aviation security policy continues to be informed by the private sector. That is why my bill would, for the first time, establish the Aviation Security Advisory Committee in statute and require that representatives from up to 27 member organizations participate. I introduced H.R. 4447 in April of 2011 with the ranking member of the Transportation Security Subcommittee of the Committee on Homeland Security, Representative Jackson Lee. It was favorably reported on a bipartisan basis in November 2011. TSA has the responsibility to secure the American public from threats posed to our transportation sector. However, it cannot do so in a vacuum. TSA must leverage technical and operational expertise from our nation's airports to deliver a collaborative and robust security system across our aviation sector. Strong partnerships with aviation stakeholders are critical to informing aviation security policy. Just last month, the committee received testimony from the Airport Minority Advisory Council about arbitrary limitations set forth by TSA on the issuance of airport worker badges to airport-based small businesses like newsstands, coffee, and souvenir shops. Since then, TSA has committed to reevaluate the policy and work with the private sector to address the concerns raised. This is just one example of how a TSA policy developed without input from the advisory committee was not informed by economic realities. Now, TSA is in the position of having to revisit this and other ill-informed policies to ensure that they enhance security in a manner that does not unduly burden the private sector. My bill also directs the administrator of TSA to establish 3 targeted working groups to address the unique homeland security challenges related to air cargo security, general aviation security, and perimeter security. Mr. Speaker, all of us have a stake in ensuring the security of our nation. Let us pass this bill so that stakeholders who are expected to comply with the policies and procedures developed by TSA have a seat at the table. That way, we can be confident that TSA's policies are both effective from a security standpoint and address the economic and commercial realities of our nation's airports. Before reserving the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to engage in a brief colloquy with the gentleman from New York, the chairman of the Committee on Homeland Security, Mr. King. Mr. Speaker, as this bill has made its way to the House floor, the chairman and I have been engaged in ongoing dialogue over how to strike the right balance on who should be represented on the Aviation Security Advisory Committee. I'm dedicated to ensuring that the voices of passengers and small and minority-owned businesses impacted by TSA's policies, procedures, and regulations are heard. It is important that persons representing those groups have a seat at the table when TSA makes decisions that affect both passengers' rights and business bottom lines. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would yield to the gentleman from New York for his assurance that this bill continues its movement through the legislative process. He will work with me to ensure these important populations are included in this Aviation Security Advisory Committee legislation.
Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the ranking member for yielding, and I agree to work with him moving forward to ensure that this issue is addressed in a manner to ensure this participation.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman from New York for his commitment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Mississippi reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers. If the gentleman from Mississippi has no more speakers, I'm prepared to close once the gentleman does.
Mr. Speaker, I have no more speakers. If the gentleman from New York has no more, then I am also prepared to close.
Once again, we're in agreement.
Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Yes. Mr. Speaker, I would like to express my gratitude to all the members of the Committee on Homeland Security for their unanimous support of this legislation when it was considered by the committee last September. While the Committee on Homeland Security has not been as active on the legislative front as I had hoped it would be this Congress, I'm pleased that several discrete bills introduced by both Democrats and Republicans have received bipartisan support on the House floor during the last month. I'll be submitting for the record letters of support for H.R. 1447 from three prominent aviation stakeholders: the U.S. Travel Association, Airport Council International North America, and the Cargo Airline Association. With that, Mr. Speaker, I urge all my colleagues to vote aye on the Aviation Security Stakeholders Participation Act and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, the private sector is a vital partner in transportation security, and the ASAC ensures that industry has a seat at the table as the government works to make our homeland more secure. I urge the adoption of this bipartisan bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1447 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds.
Speaker,
Gentleman from New York.
I object to the vote on the grounds that the quorum is not present. I make a point of order that a quorum is not present.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20 and the chair's prior announcement, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 5843.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 5843, a bill to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to permit use of certain grant funds for training conducted in conjunction with a national laboratory or research facility.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. King, and the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, it is ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this bill, introduced by Mr. Lundgren, is a simple statutory clarification that allows state and local governments and emergency management officials to use existing FEMA State Homeland Security Grant Program and Urban Area Security Initiative funds to work with national labs where appropriate. H.R. 5843 amends the Homeland Security Act of 2002 by inserting a clarification into the allowable use section of the Homeland Security Grants Program section. Clarifying this allowable use under the grants program will allow these state and local first responders to leverage the expertise at national labs for research and training purposes. This is a simple, solid, good government measure that will help maximize the use of limited federal grant dollars. This bill will allow state and local officials to cut through FEMA red tape, which makes it harder for first responders to work with the federal national labs and makes the best decisions for their homeland security needs. This bill will eliminate hoops that state and locals have to go through in order to gain access to this expertise and training. Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman from California, Mr. Lundgren, for his work on this and so many other issues, on this issue and so many others on the committee. I urge passage of the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm perplexed that the House is considering H.R. 5843 today. I cannot understand why this bill is on the schedule. It was introduced just over a month ago and has not been vetted by the committee. Why are we giving expedited attention to a bill that has just two co-sponsors, both of which are Republican? Whatever the problem it purports to solve has not been the subject of so much as a member-level briefing, let alone a hearing or a markup. Section 208A.13 of the Homeland Security Act already allows the Department to approve the spending of grant funds on training by national labs without so much as a hearing where the committee can take testimony on this matter. It is hard to justify taking up precious House floor time on this bill, especially in a week where we must take urgent action on Pell Grants and highway funding. So instead, I choose to use this time to discuss the dwindling federal support for Homeland Security activities, a far more timely concern for state, local, and tribal authorities than H.R. 5843. In the wake of the September 11th attack, as a government, we committed to safeguarding our homeland by building and preserving preparedness capabilities. Yet, since the beginning of the 112th Congress, that commitment seems to have dangerously wavered. In just 2 short years, vital Homeland Security grant programs have been significantly cut, and as a result, the level of preparedness fostered by the programs such as Urban Area Security Initiative, Port Security Grant Program, Transit Security Grant Program, and the Metropolitan Medical Response Systems have been undermined. Given that the authorizations for many of these targeted programs are expiring, a far better use of our time would be to reauthorize the Transit Security Grant Program or the Metropolitan Medical Response Program. Mr. Speaker, before I reserve my time, I would note for the record that there are 2 other much more plausible candidates for consideration by the full House that were introduced by the gentleman from California. One addressed the cybersecurity threat and was reported in April. The other authorizes DHS's Chemical Facility Security Program is pending on the Union calendar. Mr. Speaker, speaking of the Union calendar, I would also note that this bill is receiving expedited consideration, while 4 measures reported by the Committee on Homeland Security remain on the Union calendar without action. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I am proud at this time to yield as much time as you may consume to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Lundgren, who is chairman of the Subcommittee on Cybersecurity, Infrastructure Protection, and Security Technologies, and during his time on the committee has contributed as much, if not more, than any other member, and in fact returned to Congress for the purpose of doing all he could to enhance our homeland security. And with that, I yield the gentleman as much time as he may consume.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I might say that this should not be a surprise bill to anybody. This is actually a part of the authorization bill that we already worked on. It has come about as a result of the fact of complaints from local jurisdictions that they were unable to utilize funds in a way that they thought was most effective. This bill would simply permit recipients of certain FEMA grants to use this funding for training and exercises conducted in conjunction with a national lab or federal research facility. There's no additional cost. The CBO report shows there's no additional cost. In other words, the bill expands the allowable use of FEMA grants and ensures that emergency managers, first responders, and local governments can use these grant dollars to leverage the expertise of our national labs and research facilities. We have had plenty of hearings on the viability of our national labs and research facilities and the fact that we need to leverage more in these tough budget times their expertise to help us come up with solutions and prepare, among others, first responders to the challenges that we face in these times. With fewer grant dollars available, it's important that state and local governments be able to use them for the greatest public benefit. As we all know, state and local governments everywhere are also operating under severe budget limitations, and increasing the allowable use of FEMA grants helps these cash-strapped governments to address their emergency needs. Using our existing national assets for training and research is another way to efficiently leverage the scientific expertise available at these facilities. Now, I just want to correct the record. This is not just co-sponsored by two other members, both of whom are Republicans. It is co-sponsored by Representative Stark from California, Representative Lujan from New Mexico. In addition, on the Republican side, Mr. Turner from New York, Mr. Long from Missouri, Mr. Marino from Pennsylvania, Mr. Belarakis from Florida, and Mr. King from New York. We have heard not only from entities in the state of California, but I believe also in New York and New Jersey about concerns that they were unable to use their grants in the most efficient way. And absent a clarification of statutory language, FEMA was not going to allow them to participate in this way. Now, some would ask, what examples might we have of how these funds could be used? I'll just use my home state of California. The Naval Postgraduate School, which is a federal entity in Monterey, provides unique training to state and local officials through its Center for Homeland Defense and Security. The Lawrence Livermore Laboratory is a government-owned, contract-operated facility managed through a contract between the Laboratory Board of Governors and DOE's National Nuclear Security Administration. These national labs can provide a myriad of research and technical support to programs that support state and local emergency responders. Things such as risk analysis and security systems evaluation. And just another example, the Navy Space and Naval Weapons Systems Command in San Diego has substantial capability and interest in helping emergency responders with communications and nuclear detention. So we are responding in as quick a fashion as we can to complaints that we've heard from local jurisdictions that they were unable to use their FEMA grants in the most effective way, and leveraging, as I say, the expertise, the unique expertise of national labs and federal research facilities. That is the purpose of this legislation. It's very simple, one-sentence clarification of the underlying statute. I would hope that we would have unanimous support for this bill, and with that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Mississippi.
Mr. Speaker, I am prepared to close. I don't have any more speakers.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. King had to leave, and I ask unanimous consent that I take over the time.
Without objection.
And we have no further speakers, so if the gentleman would like to...
Yes.
Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we owe it to our nation's first responders to ensure that they have the resources needed to perform their jobs and to get it right. when we alter the allowable uses for those funds. Getting it right in this body requires deliberation and debate in the Committee of Jurisdiction. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the bill we are considering today failed to receive such deliberation or debate. Therefore, it's hard to say whether it is responsive to the needs of first responders. What I can say for a fact is reauthorizing key Homeland Security grant programs would bolster preparedness and be responsive to the needs of our first responders. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Mississippi yields back. The gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, this is a simple bill responding to a simple problem that actually this bill undoes red tape that ought not to be there. It leverages the best assets of the federal government, working with our first responders in our local communities in a way that they asked us to try and deal with the problem. It's not a fancy bill, simple bill, goes straight forward, and therefore I would ask a unanimous vote on this from my colleagues and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 5843? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose? Gentleman from Mississippi.
Mr. Speaker, I object to the vote on the grounds that a quorum is not present and make a point of order that a quorum is not present.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20 and the Chair's prior announcement, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3173 as amended by the Committee on Homeland Security.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 371, H.R. 3173, a bill to direct the Secretary of Homeland Security to reform the process for the enrollment, activation, issuance, and renewal of a Transportation Worker Identification Credential, TWIC, to require in total not more than one in-person visit to a designated enrollment center.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Lundgren, and the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and to include any extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, it's ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 3173 requires the Secretary of Homeland Security to reform the process for issuing the Transportation Worker Identification Credential, known as TWIC, to require not more than one in-person visit to an enrollment center except in cases with extenuating circumstances. The need for more than one trip to an enrollment center is not mandated by statute or regulation, but currently by DHS policy. Given that other very important security documents are mailed to people, including the U.S. passport, there is no doubt the federal government can develop secure procedures for delivering TWIC documents to workers. DHS has the statutory authority and regulatory flexibility to develop an alternative process for TWIC enrollment to ease the burden on transportation workers. The Secretary of Homeland Security should reform the TWIC process before the end of 2012, when the first TWICs issued in 2007 will need to be renewed, and allow applicants to complete the process in only one in-person visit. I'd like to thank Congressman Steve Scalise for the common sense bill, urge my colleagues to support it, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of H.R. 3173 and yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this measure directs the Department of Homeland Security to reform the process for the enrollment, activation, issuance, and renewal of the Transportation Worker Identification Credential, or TWIC, to require not more than one in-person visit to an enrollment center to obtain a credential. I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of this bill. Since the inception of the TWIC program in 2007, mariners and other transportation workers have had to make at least 2 trips to a TWIC enrollment center to enroll and activate their cards. In contrast, other federally issued security identity documents such as passports and merchant mariner credentials are mailed to the applicant. It is unreasonable to continue to require workers to take off from work to make a second trip to the nearest TWIC enrollment center, which in some cases is hundreds of miles away, to obtain their credential. The bill before us today would simply treat TWICs like those other federally issued identity documents. In response to this legislation and concern expressed by worker representatives and members of Congress, including me, the Obama administration recently announced a new option for port and transportation security workers who, starting this fall, will need to renew their expiring TWIC cards. Under this new opinion, TWIC holders may renew their cards for 3 years at a reduced rate of $60 and go to the enrollment center just once. I'm pleased that the administration heard us on this issue because these changes should help lessen the burden of our nation's 2.1 million port and transportation security workers as DHS moves toward issuance of a final rule for biometric readers for the TWICs. Despite these improvements, H.R. 3173 is still very necessary, as the recently announced option only applies to renewals, not first-time applicants, and there are no guarantees that it will remain in effect for the duration of the program. Passage of H.R. 3173 will be an important step forward in reforming a cumbersome bureaucratic process and providing relief for the more than 2 million transportation workers. I urge my colleagues to give H.R. 3173 their support. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Mississippi reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Pleasure to yield such time as he may consume. The distinguished gentleman from Louisiana, the author of the bill, Mr. Scalise.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the gentleman from California for yielding. I also want to thank Chairman King of New York, as well as Ranking Member Thompson of Mississippi for co-sponsoring this common sense legislation. What we're trying to do is reform a process that was started back in 2006 that really has created a lot of complications for our transportation workers. What we're talking about is 2 million Americans, not only across the country, but some who work around the globe, that have to have required, that are required by federal law to have these transportation worker identification credentials, not only to perform their jobs, but even to get promoted. And so as these cards come up, whether you're applying for them for the first time or trying to get them renewed, you have to not only make 1 but 2 in-person visits. And when we talk about these 2 visits, in many cases people have to take a day off of work for the first visit and then another day off of work for the second visit, because this is a card that they're required to have if they're going to be able to work in the transportation industry. And the rule that was put in place by TSA really is unworkable. Doesn't really make sense, and especially as we're talking about safety, it has nothing to do with safety. It's just a rule that they came up with that we recognize. Number one, it's not in law, but it's something that we've recognized, especially as we talk to our constituents who work in the transportation industry throughout the country, that this is creating tremendous burdens on our employees who have to actually miss work and miss pay that goes along with it. So we're talking about something that affects people's jobs and their careers, and in fact, in some cases has limited their ability to get promotions. I want to read parts of a letter that I received from Andrew Drury, who's an assistant cargo mate aboard the USS Mount Whitney. He's in the Merchant Marine, and this has been a problem to him. He wrote in to our office as he heard we were addressing this issue. He's a graduate of the Citadel, is employed by the Military Sealift Command, a company that is tasked with supplying the U.S. Navy with anything from bombs, bullets, fuel, and provisions to our armed forces. He works throughout Europe and Africa. And he writes to say, due to my long tours of duty overseas, his TWIC card has since expired, and, quote, I am not allowed to advance in rank or position without the current TWIC credential. He goes on to write, anybody who currently works overseas has to take time off from work and fly back to the States twice. This is very expensive, time-consuming, stressful, and because I live on a ship that constantly moves around, logistically impossible. Sir, I am writing you in hope that there is something you could do for me and my fellow merchant mariners in this precarious situation. So, as we see that 2 million of our workers across the globe are facing this problem, this is a common-sense reform that actually puts some new reforms in place, that puts some new rules in place that says you still make that first trip, but just like a passport, you shouldn't have to be required to take time off of work to go back a second time. And again, I appreciate over 40 co-sponsors in a bipartisan way that have signed on to this, and I would urge our approval of this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers, and if the gentleman from Mississippi has no further speakers, I'm prepared to close once the gentleman does.
Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you very much. I have no more speakers, and may I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, with more than 40 bipartisan co-sponsors, passage of this measure will make a strong statement of support for reform of the TWIC issuance process and American workers. I compliment the gentleman from Louisiana for introducing this legislation. I encourage passage of H.R. 3173 and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Mississippi yields back. The gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Recognized.
Mr. Speaker, nearly 2 million transportation workers have applied for and received a TWIC. The goal of this bill is to limit the red tape involved in the TWIC process so we can focus on the work of this nation while being as secure as possible. The Secretary needs to reform the Transportation Workers Identification Credential enrollment and renewal process so that our workers are not burdened with increased and unnecessary bureaucracy. As with the previously considered bill, this is an attempt by those of us in the Congress to try and get rid of some unnecessary red tape. It in no way undercuts the security of our nation. As a matter of fact, it improves it because it gets rid of a burden on people that is totally without merit. So I ask my colleagues to support its passage, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3173 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Mississippi.
Mr. Speaker, I object to the vote on the grounds that a quorum is not present and make the point of order that a quorum is not present.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20 and the Chair's prior announcement, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 697 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 139, House Resolution 697. Resolved, that at any time after the adoption of this resolution, the Speaker may, pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 28, declare the House resolved into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of the bill H.R. 5973, making appropriations for the Agriculture, Rural Development, Food and Drug Administration, and related agencies' programs for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2013, and for other purposes. The first reading of the bill shall be dispensed with. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the Chair and Ranking Minority Member of the Committee on Appropriations. After general debate, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. Points of order against provisions in the bill for failure to comply with Clause 2 of Rule 21 are waived. During consideration of the bill for amendment, the chair of the Committee of the Whole may accord priority and recognition on the basis of whether the member offering an amendment has caused it to be printed in the portion of the congressional record designated for that purpose in Clause 8 of Rule 18. Amendments so printed shall be considered as read. When the committee rises and reports the bill back to the House with such recommendation that the bill do pass, the previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill and amendments thereto to final passage without intervening motion except one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2. At any time after the adoption of this resolution, the Speaker may, pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 18, declare the House resolved into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of the bill H.R. 5972, making appropriations for the Departments of Transportation and Housing and Urban Development and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2013, and for other purposes. The first reading of the bill shall be dispensed with. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations. After general debate, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. Points of order against provisions in the bill for failure to comply with Clause 2 of Rule 21 are waived, except for Section 169C. The amendments specified in Section 3 of this resolution shall be considered as adopted in the House and in the Committee of the Whole. During consideration of the bill for further amendment, the chair of the Committee of the Whole may accord priority and recognition on the basis of whether the member offering an amendment has caused it to be printed in the portion of the congressional record designated for that purpose in Clause 8 of Rule 18. Amendments so printed shall be considered as read. When the committee rises and reports the bill as amended back to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass, the previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill and amendments thereto to final passage without intervening motion, except one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 3. The amendment referred to in Section 2 of this resolution is as follows. Insert before Section 418 the caption, Spending Reduction Account. Section 4. It shall be in order without intervention of any point of order to consider concurrent resolutions providing for adjournment during the month of July.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 hour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the purpose of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume. During consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purpose of debate only. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection,
House
the gentlelady is recognized.
House Resolution 697 provides for an open rule providing for consideration of 2 bills, H.R. 5973, which is a bill making appropriations for fiscal year 2013 for agriculture, rural development, Food and Drug Administration, and related agencies, and H.R. 5972, the fiscal year 2013 Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development and Related Agencies Appropriations Act. Mr. Speaker, House Republicans are offering yet another open rule, something that our Liberal Democrat colleagues gleefully denied this House when they held the gavel. Once again, House Republicans continue our commitment to an open appropriations process in which all members from both parties have an opportunity to influence the final legislative product. In fact, this rule represents the 11th open rule the Rules Committee has reported to the House thus far in the 112th Congress, which is in stark contrast to the 111th in which the House considered a grand total of 0 open rules. I want to thank my colleagues from the Appropriations Committee for their leadership and hard work in producing the 2 bills referenced in this rule. H.R. 5973 includes $19.4 billion in discretionary funding, which represents a cut of $365 million below last year's level. H.R. 5972 provides a total of $51.6 billion in discretionary spending for the departments and agencies funded in the bill for fiscal 2013, which is a level representing $3.9 billion below last year's level. While my liberal colleagues would undoubtedly prefer to borrow and spend more and continue to ignore the dire fiscal realities of our country, House Republicans remain committed to reining in wasteful spending, even if it involves making difficult and sometimes unpopular decisions in order to save our country from fiscal ruin. The simple truth is we cannot afford to fund every program at the bloated levels that for many years kept political promises but in the end hurt the fiscal stability of our country. It would be unconscionable to continue indebting future generations to creditors like China without working to reduce federal spending, which is the real driver of our deficit. These are important bills, Mr. Speaker, and I'm proud that House Republicans, led by our esteemed Rules Committee Chairman Richard Dreyer, have embraced an open process to consider this legislation. We welcome the support of our Democrat colleagues on the final passage of the underlying legislation, and at this time, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentle lady from North Carolina, Dr. Fox, for yielding me the customary 30 minutes. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, before I begin, I just would like to point out to my colleagues that I don't want them to be under the misimpression that somehow this Republican leadership is somehow conducting an open and transparent process. At last count, they have given us 41 completely closed rules, and that's not even getting into the number of structured rules we've had. So I would be a little bit more humble before I would brag about the open process in this House. I rise in opposition to this rule, which combines two unrelated appropriations bills: Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development, and the Agriculture Appropriations bills. And this rule also concedes that the House Republicans will not finish all of their appropriation bills on time. Under the House rules, the House cannot adjourn for more than 3 days in a row in July unless all the appropriation bills are finished. Section 4 in this rule is an admission that the Republican leadership hasn't met this threshold. Mr. Speaker, I also oppose this rule because Republican budget caps have made it impossible to bring appropriations bills to the floor that meet the needs of our country. Rather than a balanced, fair approach to control our federal deficit, Republicans have launched an all-out assault against middle-income families and those who are struggling in poverty. Rather than asking Donald Trump to pay 1 penny more in taxes, the Republicans are pursuing an agenda that would decimate food stamps, that turns Medicare into a voucher program, that goes after student loans, and I go on and on and on. Everything that they bring to this floor lowers the quality of life and the standard of living for the people in this country. This Congress should be about lifting people up, not putting people down. And yet the bills that get brought to this floor time and time again are all about putting the American people down. Not only is the underlying transportation appropriations bills underfunded, but we're considering it while the ninth extension of the Surface Transportation Bill, the bill that funds our roads and bridges, is on the verge of expiring, and as summer construction season quickly moves towards a close. We need a transportation bill, and we would have one, Mr. Speaker, if the Republican leadership would simply accept the bipartisan Senate bill. Instead, the Republican leadership has decided to play politics by including unrelated provisions like the construction of the Keystone Pipeline in a bill meant to build and repair America's roads and bridges, in a bill that would have put thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans to work on these critical projects. I had the honor of hosting Transportation Secretary Ray LaHood, a former Republican member of this body, in my congressional district yesterday. Secretary LaHood made it clear that Congress needs to get its act together and pass a transportation bill. Rather than more recesses, I would say to my friends, we ought to stay here and not leave until we get this bill passed. Instead, this transportation appropriations bill is essentially a shell full of placeholder language waiting for the authorization bill to be finished. This is not a way to legislate. You know, my friends on the other side of the aisle like to say, where are the jobs? Well, I'll tell you where the jobs are. They're in this transportation bill that they are holding up, that they are holding hostage. You want to put Americans back to work? Pass this bill. I'm also deeply disappointed, Mr. Speaker, that this is the second year in a row that the appropriations bill fails to fund the Sustainable Communities Initiative, which brings together the Department of Transportation, HUD, and EPA to develop effective models of integrated planning and promote economic development in metropolitan areas across the country. We should be pursuing the smart, holistic approaches to urban planning and improvement encouraged by the Sustainable Communities Initiative, and this bill doesn't do that. I also have concerns with the project-based Section 8 funding level included in the T-HUD legislation and with proposals to short-fund project-based contracts. Short funding does not reduce federal expenditures, but instead shifts the cost to the next fiscal year. In fact, according to the National Housing Trust, short funding can increase financing costs because of the uncertainty it creates among lenders and investors. Short funding is a direct result of the need to conform to the Ryan budget, and I hope that the Senate's funding level is adopted during this conference, if they ever do have a conference. And the sad reality, Mr. Speaker, is that these two appropriations bills, the Transportation, Housing and Urban Development Appropriation Bill, of the two transportation bills, the Transportation, Housing and Urban Development Appropriations Bill is the better one. This Agriculture Appropriations Bill is, to put it nicely, not where it needs to be. It is woefully inadequate in several places, and it continues a pattern set by this Republican leadership of trying to undermine the Wall Street reforms made under Dodd-Frank and to dismantle the anti-hunger safety net. This bill decimates funding for the Commodity Futures Trading Corporation, one of the key regulators of the financial services industry. In fact, the bill cuts funding for the CFTC by 41%, a cut that will drastically reduce CFTC's ability to oversee an industry that continues to take risky gambles, as evidenced by J.P. Morgan's recent loss of $2 billion. The Republican leadership once again would rather allow Wall Street to run amok instead of providing proper oversight so that Americans on Main Street don't get taken to the cleaners. Also not surprising is this Republican's leadership continued assault on the hungry in America. Over the past 18 months, the Republican leadership has pushed two plans to block Grant SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, dramatically cut WIC funding in last year's Agriculture Appropriations Bill, and brought a reconciliation bill to the floor that would cut $36 billion from SNAP, the most effective and efficient federal anti-hunger program we have in this country. And of course, we're still anticipating a farm bill from the Agriculture Committee that will cut at least $14 billion from this program. And while this bill funds WIC at $6.9 billion, it is still $119 million short of President Obama's request. In essence, this bill is gambling that food prices and participation will stabilize and not continue to rise. But just as concerning is the lack of set-asides for breastfeeding counselors, electronic benefit cards, and infrastructure. These provisions were included in the President's request and also in the Senate bill. They should not be excluded from the House version. The other problem with the WIC language is the provision dealing with white potatoes. For the first time, Congress is mandating that white potatoes be included in the WIC food package. This is unprecedented and deeply troubling. Congress has never until now interfered with the science of the WIC food package. This food package was specifically designed by the Institute of Medicine to provide the necessary nutrients through specific foods that are often not consumed for a variety of reasons by low-income pregnant women and their newborns, infants, and young children. Like the effort to treat pizza as a vegetable, this is clearly done on behalf of the industry. It does not belong in this bill. This bill also cuts the Commodity Supplemental Food Program below the President's request. This program provides food to seniors across the country, but the funding level in this bill is so inadequate that it will actually result in 55,000 fewer seniors being served. That's 55,000 fewer low-income seniors on fixed incomes who will have food taken away from them simply because the committee decided tightening our nation's fiscal belt should mean less food for elderly in America instead of less profits for the wealthy. The Agricultural Appropriations Bill doesn't spare international food aid from drastic cuts either. This bill cuts Title II PL 480 by 22%, or $316 million under FY 2002 levels, and $250 million below the President's FY 13 request. These dramatic cuts would result in decreases in emergency services to between 6 and 8 million vulnerable people, some of whom already are already on the brink of starvation. They also weaken funding for programs that fight long-term hunger and build the capacity of people to withstand new emergencies. For example, it was the Food for Peace development programs in Ethiopia that helped keep communities from falling into famine and withstand the shock of last year's drought, saving the American taxpayer hundreds of millions of dollars. Not only are these cuts unconscionable, they are unwise because they will ultimately lead to future costs should there be widespread hunger, famine, or civil unrest that requires American assistance. Mr. Speaker, we need to do better. We must do better. We need a surface transportation bill that actually puts Americans back to work. I ask again my Republican friends to stop holding the Senate bill hostage, bring it to the floor, let us have an up or down vote on it, let us pass it, get people back to work. We need to ensure that Wall Street doesn't once again run unchecked. And we need to guarantee that we don't let Americans go hungry during these difficult economic times. The Republican agenda, is quite contrary to where I think the majority of Americans are. And we're seeing that agenda, that radical right-wing agenda, at work in these appropriations bills. I'll just close with this. Mr. Speaker, my colleagues on the other side like to talk about numbers all the time. Well, I like to talk about people. I got elected to Congress to help people. And as I said at the beginning of my remarks, the agenda by this Republican majority is all about putting people down. We should be about lifting people up in this country. We can meet our budgetary challenges without lowering the standard of living for the people of this country. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to reject this rule, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Latham.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the Speaker and thank the gentlewoman from North Carolina for yielding time. I'm very pleased to speak in favor of the rule on H.R. 5972, the fiscal year 2013 Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Bill. I want to thank the Chairman and Ranking Member of the Rules Committee for their assistance in moving this important bill forward. I also want to thank Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Dix for their commitment to moving appropriation bills through the House so that we can fund America's priorities, while demonstrating the committee's proven record of cutting waste, fraud, and abuse. I, in particular, want to thank the THUD Ranking Member John Olver for his assistance in crafting this legislation. This is his last THUD bill before retiring at the end of this year. The Transportation and HUD bill represents responsible choices for our nation's most pressing housing and transportation needs. This bill's allocation of $51.6 billion is almost $4 billion below fiscal year 2012 and almost $2 billion below the President's request. The bill also reflects the budget resolution passed by the House. The bill is largely free of authorizations, leaving that important work to the Transportation and Infrastructure and Financial Services Committee. As the amendments to the THUD bill are rolling in, we're seeing a very familiar theme, authorizing provisions. There are a multitude of issues, especially in the transportation title and the housing title, that are very desperately needed to be considered and acted upon by the authorizing committees of jurisdiction. A number of members have good ideas for improving these programs, and the authorizers need to have the opportunity to turn these ideas into law. The Appropriations Committee can only deal with existing laws, so I would urge my colleagues with amendments that are out of order, please bring these issues to the relevant chairman, and let's improve the underlying statutes. We can't make these authorizing changes on this appropriations bill. I urge my colleagues to support the rule. I look forward to the general debate on the Transportation and HUD bill and a very speedy amendment process. And I thank the gentlelady again, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, the ranking member of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Agriculture, Mr. Farr.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much for yielding. I rise in strong opposition to the 19-4 $4.05 billion allocation that our Subcommittee on Agriculture and Food and Drug Administration and related agencies received. But I rise in support of the rule for moving this process forward with a great floor debate. The allocation to our community was given to us as $1.7 billion, or 8% below what the President requested. And it is $365 million, or 1.8% below what we enacted in the House last year in 2012. Chairman Kingston, my colleague in the Republican side of the aisle, who's chair of our committee, does a great job. And he's talked about how, well, we have savings that have been found, and in tough budget times, well, everybody's got to tighten their belts. And we all know that. But what about the cost of tightening those belts, and who's going to depend on those programs that in many ways are their survival? I feel several programs have been cut so deep they will either be unable or to have difficulty in performing the duties of those programs. This bill slashes Food for Peace by 22%. Now let me be crystal clear about what this cut means. And Mr. McGovern just spelled it out very clearly. It's a wrong thing to do. It means 6 to 8 million people will face starvation. 6 to 8 million people. Cutting food aid only increases the need to bump up other, more costly efforts later on. It means that 44,000 Americans who produce that food could be losing their jobs. Those include farmers, shippers of food, processors, port workers, and merchant mariners who ship it across the seas. I also feel that where this bill is going, in another example, is to cut 41% from the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. 41%. That's misguided and shows a lack of understanding of its oversight responsibilities. A failure to fund robust oversight will only hurt American taxpayers. The CFTC is charged with the oversight of unregulated swaps, $300 trillion a year, 300 trillions of these swaps, and grossly unregulated. This regulatory oversight protects the American taxpayer and reckless Wall Street behavior that caused the 2008 financial crisis. We all know that a reckless Wall Street behavior led to the collapse of the housing market, which is still dragging down economic growth in all of our communities across America. We in Congress need to restore the people's confidence in our ability to govern and to regulate Wall Street and to benefit Main Street. We in Congress need to restore the CFTC funding. And remember that the FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration, oversees 80% of our nation's food supply, including foods from more than 3,000 facilities in 200 countries around the world. And I appreciate the effort here to bump up food safety modernization implementation. However, the total Food and Drug Administration is funded at $16 million under what we gave them last year, and $31 million below what was requested for this year. And as you know, the addition to overseeing most of our food supply is responsible for the safety of drugs and medical devices, many of which are imported to the United States. In closing, I do think that Chairman Kingston made a good effort in crafting this bill, given the allocation he had to deal with. I support this rule and look forward to continue to work with him as we move forward on this bill. And let's have a good, hearty debate and adopt some amendments to correct it. Thank you very much. Yield back.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the bills that will receive consideration under this open rule is H.R.